Everyone for joining this morning's session on mobilizing private finance for forest restoration and regenerative business models. So the goal of this panel discussion is to showcase a great set of examples on innovative and successful restoration-focused business models on the African continent. And we have with us today panelists who are representing the various actors or partners required for the setup and implementation of successful businesses, including smallholders, market access players, investors, and public institutions. I would now like to invite Mamadou Diakité, who is the manager of the Africa Forest Landscape Restoration Initiative, or AFR 100, Secretariat at the AU NEPAD.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Answer me, please. Good morning. Good morning. And yes, as Feker said, my name is Mamadou Diakité, and I work for the African Union Development Agency, AUDA NEPAD, based in South Africa, Johannesburg. And we have launched the Africa Forest Landscape Restoration Initiative, AFR 100, back in 2015. At the COP21, at the margin of COP21 in Paris. And I think it is at that time that all the land issues, land restoration, agriculture were being slowly, little by little, recognized in the UNFCCC process. Before we used to talk about the LULUCF, the land use change, and forestry, but now moving to really land restoration as one of the means, one of the vehicles to address climate change challenges, and also as contributing to limiting the global mean temperature by 1.5 degrees. So land restoration is really one of the means to attain that goal. So the AFR 100 initiative is composed now of 32 countries of Africa, and 33 actually. Since yesterday, Somalia joined here. We received the letter of Somalia, and basically we made the deal here in at the UK pavilion with the Minister of Somalia. So we have 33 countries aiming at restoring more than 130 million hectares of degraded land and forests by 2030. So we are aligned with the SDGs, with the ecosystem decade, UN decade on ecosystem restoration, on the Bonn Challenge, and New York Declaration on forests, and all those types of objectives. We have more or less 4 main pillars for AFR 100. First, a strong mobilization of African countries to really show to the rest of the world that Africa looks for land restoration as really one of the key elements of its development. So, so that's why we say that AFR 100 is a country-owned and led initiative. The second one, which is I think the point of this meeting, strong resource and partnership mobilization. And I can mention briefly the P4F cooperation with P4F in the last 5 years is to technical support really through seconding experts. P4F is seconding 3 experts on regional coordination, but also on monitoring, and also mobilizing the private sector. So mobilizing countries, resource mobilization and partnership. The third pillar is knowledge generation, packaging, and dissemination. That if we have good practices, best practices in the Sahel region, in Niger, that can be packaged in a way to be disseminated in other Sahel countries, mostly in the Great Green Wall countries. We work a lot with Great Green Wall as another initiative of African Union. And the last pillar is monitoring. And we are really very strict and strong in monitoring, little by little developing a monitoring platform that not only use the satellite imagery and GPS coordinates, but also remote sensing, but also going to the ground, working with young people to monitor restoration on the ground. So I think by being at the macro level, we are really able to bring all the stakeholders to join the AFR 100 and make meaningful impact on land restoration. But in Africa, when we say land restoration, we think about sustainable agriculture, we think about food security, we think about conservation. So that's why this initiative with P4F is very important to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Mamadou. So a quick introduction on myself. My name is Fikr Taddessa, and I'm the East Africa Regional Manager for a UK government-funded program called Partnerships for Forests. And this is a program which works on identifying and incubating sustainable business models across the tropical belt. We do this by following a PPP, or private-public people-centered approach, whereby we ensure the environment, communities, and investors all benefit from the businesses that we support to grow, scale, and replicate. We have just heard from Mamadou on the work that AFR 100 has been doing so far. And as he mentioned, P4F support has been in particular focused on establishing national platforms in different countries across Eastern, Southern, Central, and Western Africa for policy dialogue, capacity building, and private sector investment into restoration activities on the ground. So before we kick off this panel discussion, I would like to show you some examples of what restoration activity actually looks like on the ground. This particular example is from Brazil, but similar activities are happening in Africa. And this is a good example of a successful restoration project which serves as an interesting blueprint to be replicated globally.
Hoje a região aqui, se você sair nos vizinhos, todo mundo tá voltado à ideia de plantar o cacau. Que a gente olhava assim, era impossível, né, voltar para isso. Hoje eles estão plantando, né, eles estão recuperando a área de pastagem, né, com cacau.
O projeto Cacau Floresta iniciou no ano de 2013, com engajamento e adesões dos agricultores familiares entre o município de São Félix do Xingu e o município de Tucumã.
A gente começou fazendo o levantamento das áreas do passivo ambiental, né, do pequeno agricultor. Então a gente começa a trabalhar, voltar a mentalidade dele de integrar a pecuária com a lavoura, que a grande maioria aqui das propriedades tem lavoura, de cacau, tem açaí, a própria pecuária, e tem uma parte que precisa ser recuperada. Eu estava falando para ele que essa área aqui está com pretensão de reabilitar ela novamente, né? Plantar cacau nesse setor aqui, né? A gente vai plantar o cacau aqui, ó. Cacau é banana, essas coisas. Talvez quando vocês vierem aqui um ano, talvez, deve estar modificado aqui.
A evolução do projeto Cacau Floresta ele vem na assistência técnica, com o melhoramento do solo, melhoramento da nutrição de plantas, fazendo um arranjo mais adensado dentro desse sistema agroflorestal, não só com cacau, mas sim com outras espécies que agregam valor dentro dessa área. Isso trabalha o aumento de produtividade dessas famílias, né, a qualidade desses produtos que são produzidos dentro do sistema agroflorestal.
Que é um pequeno experimento que a gente começou, né, com a TNC aí, né, a gente colocou 4 fileiras de açaí e 6 de cacau, feijão mandu, a gente colocou o feijão caupi e o feijão de porco. Aí eu comecei assim, colocando o coentro, né, essa porque foi a parte do primeiro projeto, aí ficou um pouco de cebola, um pouco de cada planta, né. Aí eu já comecei assim, já arranquei que vocês estão vendo falhado, mas é porque eu já levei para feira. Aí vem a rúcula, era mais monocultura, né? E hoje tem essa diversidade, né? Eu me vejo na diversidade. A gente está aí lidando para ver se a gente aglomera para ter uma rentabilidade melhor.
Da juva, tem as árvores nativas, tipo, ó, tem angelim, tem castanha, que precisa no manejo do cacau para fazer sombra. Claro que a gente depende do cacau, depende da coisa, mas a gente precisa dessa biodiversidade para manter a nossa produção, né?
A gente agradece a assistência técnica, né? Porque a gente entrou aqui, é como se diz, entrou no escuro. Porque um vem ensina uma coisa, outro vem ensina outra, e em cima dessas bases que a gente tem se alavancado um pouco.
E hoje é a segunda economia do município, né? Hoje todos os pequenos agricultores querem plantar cacau. Então, para isso, a gente está na expectativa de sempre aumentando a produção, aumentando o produtor e aumentando a demanda, né, de produção dentro do município.
Todos querem se capacitar, todos querem produzir mais, produzir melhor, com qualidade, com mais benefício, com conhecimento, né? Agregar mais valor e rentabilidade.
Porque em muitos lugares aqui, ali tem um vizinho ali que a terra dele era toda de pasto, né? Hoje você vai lá, mudou a paisagem todinha, né? Tá toda cobertada de cacau. E todo mundo que investiu no cacau, hoje eles são patrão. E a família vive de maneira estável, bem.
A gente já se orgulha disso. Nós sabemos que o que plantamos aí, a gente já tem um futuro pela frente já seguro.
So that was one of our projects in Brazil, and now coming back to Africa. P4F has also supported the forestry enterprise Komaza, who are here with us today. Komaza are an early pioneer in smallholder forestry. They partner with smallholders to establish high-quality farms on degraded land. We are joined by Eloise Zimmerman, who is the senior carbon manager at Komaza. P4F also helped to launch the new 200 million Africa Forest Investment Platform, which is being managed by New Forests, a global forestry fund manager. Unfortunately, Paulo Haga is unable to join us today, but we have Ellen Brooks joining us from British International Investors, given BII's role as an anchor investor on the fund. So welcome. Beyond P4F, the UK is also delivering other aid programs in the sustainable land use space. For example, the Mobilising Finance for Forests program is another UK ODA program funded, focused on mobilizing private finance for the sustainable land use sector. We're lucky enough to have the delivery partner with us today, the Dutch Development Finance Institution, FMO, and we are joined by Jorhem Schrijven, Director of Strategy at FMO. Welcome. And finally, this transition couldn't happen without the involvement of smallholder farmers. The UK is supporting other programs like the Just Rural Transition. We have a representative from the Malawi Farmers Union to talk to us today. Derek Capolo is head of agribusiness. Welcome. And I'm actually going to kick off the first question to you, Derek. What is your organization doing to encourage a shift towards restorative and regenerative business models in Malawi and beyond?
Thank you very much. First of all, I really wanted to thank the organizers for inviting farmers on this table. The question has always been to say, we talk about planting trees, deforestation, regeneration, but I think it is coming very evident to say that we cannot sustainably talk about regeneration if we leave out farmers from the equation. So bringing the farmers on this discussion is very important. In fact, there's a common saying that goes to say, if you are not on the table, then you're on the menu. So we really feel this as a privilege to be here. What we are doing specifically in Malawi, we are doing a number of things. First of all, as a farmers union, we do advocacy because we understand that the government also has a role in creating enabling policy environment for PPPs that you just mentioned. So we engage the government. Every year, my government has a tree planting week, but that does not correspond to the budget allocations. And at the same time, we look at the private sector. There isn't really a clear policy as regards to how then the private sector engage with the farmers on reforestation and regeneration. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect, we are looking at capacity building of the farmers, and at the same time, awareness raising on the effects of the climate change. So we do a number of capacity building on sustainable land and water use, so that farmers should be on the know. The third issue is that we collaborate. Just for the past 3 years, we have collaborated with the private sector companies, the banks, seed companies, to support reforestation and regeneration efforts. So in a nutshell, that's what we have done so far in making sure that we are bringing these messages to the farmers. Thank you.
Thanks, Derek. Indeed, I think, smallholders are central to these interventions, so couldn't agree more. Eloise, Komaza also works with smallholders, and can you tell us a little bit about Komaza, its journey so far, and particularly on your efforts on restoring degraded land, and also if you can go into how your model brings financial returns to you, the smallholder partners, while also reducing the pressure on Kenya's natural forests.
I'll try to cover. Can you hear me? Yes. So the story of Komaza started 15 years ago with its founder and still current CEO, Tavis Howard. He was living in a small town in the coast of Kenya, and noticed that the rural community there was living in great poverty, even though they had a pretty vast resource in the land they owned. But this land was already at that time increasingly degraded. It was not as productive as it used to be, and therefore most of it would be sitting empty. So Tavis created this model where Komaza would bring seedlings, trainings, tools to farmers so they could plant small woodlots of fast-growing trees on this empty land and be paid a decade later when the trees are harvested and transformed into wood products. So it's really been designed as a win-win partnership where the farmers can find value again in the empty and degraded land that they own, and Komaza can develop a wood supply without having to purchase any land, which for Komaza is actually a huge factor of cost saving because most of the costs in forestry come from land acquisition and building all the infrastructure, and for us, we actually save 80% of land and labor costs in the first year of operations. So it means for each dollar invested in Komaza, we can plant 5 times more trees. And that creates additional revenues in the end that can be shared with our farmers, with our investors, and help us grow every year the planted area in Kenya. And so fast forward 15 years, today Komaza is partnering with 30,000 farmers. We plant 2 million trees every year, and we're on track to become the largest VCS and CCB certified afforestation project in the country. And so that's also a demonstration of the climate impact of this model, which is, of course, restoring degraded land and also being a wonderful tool for carbon sequestration. Trees are a very efficient, natural carbon sink, especially when the wood is turned into wood products, because then the sink becomes durable, and that's something we plan to expand in the country and probably abroad as well.
Great, thanks Eloise. Ellen, I'm going to come to you next. So I understand that BII was an anchor investor in the Africa Forestry Platform that was launched just a few weeks ago. Can you tell us a little bit more about the fund, its mandates, and then also go into how it will contribute to restoration and conservation efforts on the continent?
Yes, great. Very, very happy to. And I'm standing in for Paula Hager from New Forest, who is the fund manager for Africa Forestry Impact Platform. So I will try to do New Forest justice. But a bit of context just about British International Investments before I start. We are the UK's development finance institution, so we're fully owned by the UK government, and really we use aid money to invest as an impact investor. So we're investing for financial return, which we recycle into other impactful investments, but also for impact and development impact. And forestry is a really important sector for us to be able to achieve that. And just to quickly highlight that we have a few forestry investments. So we're invested indirectly in Kamaza, so it's great to be here with you on the panel. We also invested in Criterion African Partners, another forestry fund, and an African forestry fund called Myro Forestry, which FMO is also invested in, which operates in West Africa. So we have this portfolio of forestry investments, but really at COP26 last year, we committed that we wanted to do more in this space and that we were going to partner with New Forests alongside Norfund and FinFund to raise 500 million for investment in sustainable forestry in Africa. I'm really pleased that we've come back to the next COP, having done the first close of this fund in October. So we've closed the first round, which is 200 million. And so I want to just deep dive really into AFIP, really because it's still fundraising and it's an incredible opportunity to invest in African forestry, and because it's this most recent investment that we've done in the last 12 months. There's a bit of preamble. I guess your question was, what's AFIP doing and how's it doing it? AFIP is investing in sustainable forestry across sub-Saharan Africa. And within the mandate, that could be greenfield plantations, existing plantations, brownfield plantations, forest restoration, or natural forestry concessions. So that's within the mandate. We've got one anchor asset already, which is Green Resources. This is a greenfield plantation. And then we're looking to build out that pipeline further. Another thing to say is this is a very patient capital vehicle. And I think that's really important for the forestry sector, because we know that planting trees, as you've rightly pointed out, does take some time before you can harvest. And so that patient capital element to AFIP is really important. So that's sort of the what. The how is that this fund has really sustainable forestry at its core. And we've baked 4 areas of impact into the impact targets within the fund and the fund structure, which is something I'm really excited about, because this is it's still emerging best practice in the impact investment industry to have these targets so central to your investment. And those target areas are jobs and livelihoods. So we're absolutely investing to bring prosperity to the people who work within the company, but around the asset. Gender equality, so the fund is 2x qualified and has gender action targets within it. Carbon, which you've mentioned, carbon sequestered, and if we do a natural forestry investment, emissions avoided will be key to the fund's impact target. And the fourth, but not least area, is biodiversity. And having that anchored in the fund, I think, means that we are really confident that we're going to achieve the impact that we want to progress on. And I can say a bit more about the structure of the fund and the landscape-based approach that we're taking as well, maybe in the next question or so.
Yeah, thank you. Joram, I understand you deliver a program called Mobilising Finance for Forests with the UK government. How does this blended finance program work? And specifically, what does blending allow you to do in this sector?
Right, yes, it's indeed it's a very exciting program to us that we run for the UK government. We are the Dutch Development Bank, essentially the Dutch equivalent to BII, and a public-private partnership. So in our case, there's also actually some private shareholders in the mix. So this public-private partnership thinking is really at the core. And I think blending speaks to that. So it's really around mixing public money with private money, de-risking private investors so that they gradually become comfortable with business models that at their core do work, or maybe take a little bit more time to become commercially viable. And I think these principles really sit at the center of the Mobilising Finance for Forests program that we run. It's a £150 million program that's focusing on reducing deforestation and actually looking at forest conservation as well as reforestation investments across the board, and we'll talk a bit more about examples later, I think. And it's a very exciting program to us that we're running for the UK government, and it's actually also changed our own strategy by now. So we've announced that we're building our own portfolio of 500 million to 1 billion over time, and there we're shifting in part, I think, based on the experiences that we already have had in the MFF program, Beyond plantations, so we're really also now going to look at more restorative projects. So I think these kind of blended finance programs really do have an impact on both development finance institutions, and we also trust later on private sector investors to change the way they look at what is actually possible in this restorative space.
Yeah. Wonderful, thank you. Ellen, I'm going to come back to you. So if you can go into a little bit about, how, what are some of the challenges in terms of like building an investment pipeline in the African context?
Sure, absolutely. There are challenges, but I certainly think there's also great opportunity. Right. And that's certainly what we've seen when we were looking at investing in sustainable forestry. And we only invest in Africa and South Asia. We've recently expanded to include the Caribbean and some of Southeast Asia, but Africa and South Asia are our core investment markets. And so really, when you look at African forestry, it's not as developed, I would say, as what we're seeing in Latin America or Southeast Asia, and therefore I think there's a real opportunity to invest for development and impact returns in this space. So we're really excited about investing and AFIP being focused on sub-Saharan Africa. I think your question was around brownfield plantations as well, and
exactly. If you can go into how do you actually move beyond brownfield plantations?
So our first asset is Green Resources. It is a brownfield plantation, and what we hope to do there is really increase growth rates and increase the supply of sustainable wood products that come from that plantation. And really, I think this is hugely important because it allows really a shift to a bioeconomy, which I think is something that lots of people will be talking about today. But we know that we need lots of sustainable wood products to be able to shift away from oil-based textiles or oil-based packaging and really to drive the shift to a bioeconomy. So I think the supply of sustainable wood coming from sustainable sources, not deforestation sources, is hugely important for sustainable development. So I'm super excited about the impact that that plantation is having. What we can also do, and really are partnering with P4F to do, is look at the landscapes around this asset and think about taking a landscape-based approach. So how can we use investment capital and P4F capital to think about sustainable livelihoods, reforestation, other land restoration projects around the assets that deliver sustainable livelihoods and carbon and biodiversity benefits. And having that anchor asset, you can then look at the landscapes around that.
Yeah.
So I'm being attacked by a fly.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are the two things that I think really brownfield plantation allows you to do. It's already hugely impactful, but this is the first asset in AFIP's pipeline, and then AFIP will go on to use the revenue from this first asset to invest in other perhaps assets with different cash flow profiles, like new tree planting, afforestation, restoration, natural forestry. So it certainly is, I think, a great first investment for the fund to make, and then can go on from there.
Yeah, it's great. And I think, similar to Derek's point earlier, how important smallholders are, I think another really good point that you brought up is the landscape approach. And not just looking at assets as isolated, assets to invest in, but to also look at it holistically, and how do you actually make the core investments more socially and environmentally viable in the long run by identifying these smaller business models around the core assets. Thank you for that. Eloise, keeping in the theme of challenges, can you go into, what are some of the challenges that you faced, to overcome operating in the African context, specifically in Kenya, and how do you ensure your model is delivering positive impact for climate, people, and also importantly, biodiversity?
A big challenge for Comasa, Comasa is smallholder forestry, so it's forestry, as you mentioned, it requires patient capital, but it's also smallholder, so it's unconventional forestry. So when we started the project, all these great initiatives did not exist yet, so most of the traditional forestry investors would be very risk averse. So to overcome this difficulty to access capital, we've had to take a venture approach and basically leverage a lot of grants and concessional capital to de-risk our model step by step. So we first leveraged grants to develop the project design and run pilots, and then got access to venture capital where we could develop the digital tools we use to make it possible to work with tens of thousands of smallholder farmers. Then impact investing came in to replicate the model, etc., etc. And now we are at the stage where we can finally take on debt and private capital, but it's been a journey. So hearing about the fact that founders now really take into account the life cycle of the project and blended finance is coming to the rescue to finance different parts of the business that need different type of capital. It's an excellent news for restoration projects. And that's very much needed if we want to scale them further. And I mean, something very exciting for us too in terms of funding is carbon finance, which is becoming now available and is not only a great way to bridge project revenues and profitability, like it's the case for us, but it's also an incentive to monitor better your impact and enhance it, because it's now directly linked to additional revenues. So in the case of Comasa, we have this BCS and CCB certification that's going to come into force very soon, and requires us to monitor very carefully our impact on our farmers, on the environment in terms of carbon, but also in terms of biodiversity impact. And so that's very interesting because we can apply industry best practices to our project. And start remeasuring things that have always been words on paper so far. So that's and also a great way, as you asked me, how to make sure we maintain this impact is to work with experts in the field, and that's also what this carbon certification allowed us to do, is to really ensure that the project is designed in a way that I mean, when you plant trees, you can plant trees in a good way or in a bad way. When you measure trees, you can measure them in a good way or in a bad way. It's very important to make sure everything is designed with the impact in mind. And the fact that you can monetize it now is an extremely positive incentive to do so.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Eloise. Derek, I'm going to come to you next. In your opinion, what are the main barriers hindering farmers from adopting restorative or regenerative practices? And how could these barriers to investment be overcome?
Thank you very much. I think for me, the main barrier is the cost. Of course, there are issues of land holding size, but farmers always have the marginal land where they can do afforestation work and regeneration work. You may agree with me that afforestation or regeneration is mainly involved with two costs. The first cost is the direct monetary cost. This monetary cost is to do with the buying of the seedlings, the acquirement of the knowledge for the management of the forest itself. And the other cost is the opportunity cost now of that land, or even if they have a forestry area, there is always an opportunity cost involved. So if we are to ask who was paying for that cost, initially the farmers, especially in the context of the Southern Africa, the farmers were paying for that cost. But now the landscape has changed, commodity markets are crashing, and the cost of inputs are increasing. So farmers no longer have the money to support or pay for that. So now, unfortunately, farmers are now going back to the same forest resources in order to sustain their living. I can give an example. In Malawi and most Southern Africa countries, we found that the cost of charcoal has gone up 200%, even the cost of wood. So farmers are finding it to make more money through just selling or depleting the landscape than even in the actual farming. So if we can really come up with models that can really incentivize or monetize afforestation work, I think to me, I feel like that can be the best way to go. I like the partnership that Comasa is doing, engaging with the farmers to make sure that they should really see monetary value in the afforestation work. I can say that it's a bit tricky for the southern part of Africa because land holding size is customary. So my mom has land that she got from her mom. So the issue is that nobody can tell a farmer what to do with his or her own land. So I can clear vegetation for my land. The government doesn't have the power. I would just say I want to open a new farm. That's it. So if we can really attach money value to the afforestation work, carbon financing, even carbon markets, to me I feel like little by little, even farmers would see really value for really doing a little afforestation work, and even start thinking about how can we regenerate our forest landscapes. So for me, I feel like the current agricultural systems are really facing a challenge of crashing commodity markets, but that can be an opportunity to enable our farmers now to start looking at how can we promote, for example, crop trees. How can we integrate non-wood forestry products in the afforestation work? For example, honey production, beekeeping. If you can have those kind of models whereby farmers can regenerate their forest landscapes, we introduce beekeeping, by the end of the day, the farmers will be able to see the connection between the afforestation and earning a living. So I think in a nutshell, that's how I can say it. We have to really think around monetization of the afforestation, especially in the context of the smaller farmers. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, excellent points. Joachim, can you give us some examples of specific transactions in your portfolio which support restoration land use practices?
Sure, yeah, so we've got over 10 years of track record in the sector. So some earlier investments included New Forest Company, which, just to confuse everybody, is not the same as a New Forest Fund that Alan is talking about. But I guess it's a sign of success of a sector that we're seeing some duplication of names these days. So we invested over 20 million there, and then we also actually invested in Kamasa, more than 10 million, which has been great. And talking to the MFF program, which of course is a bit more recent, very excited about an investment we did in the And Green Fund, which itself is again a blended finance fund, focusing on restoration, also of peatlands, very creative models they're employing to kind of regenerate forests. And they have a special focus on the Congo Basin as well, which we think is a very exciting area where a lot needs to be done. So that's been a very exciting investment under the program. And we're also very happy to announce today our investment in Treevive. This is an early stage company that's setting up a platform for carbon programs, and also they're looking to regenerative projects, especially in Africa. They already have a number in the pipeline, so we're very excited about that under the MFF program as well.
That's great. Congratulations on that. Quite an achievement. So can you actually go into a little bit more detail on how does an investment like Treevive, the program that you just mentioned, make restoration investments more attractive to commercial investors in the long run? And how can we find the right balance between generating revenue, improving livelihoods, and meeting ambitious climate and biodiversity goals?
Sure, yeah, so there's a lot of impact ambitions that we have, and ultimately we want private sector investors to step in. So I think Treevive is a good example of a problem you're trying to solve for, which is you're trying to get these projects through what investors call the valley of death. So there's typically an early period where it's very difficult to get commercial capital because the returns are still far out. In the forestry space, especially if you look at degraded land, for example, which is something that they'll be tackling, you tend to have a period early on where you regenerate the land and make it suitable for production and actual revenues. That's a stage in the project that's very difficult to finance commercially. So I think that is precisely where blended finance is absolutely crucial to do that kind of work. And once you've cleared that stage, the revenues can start to come in either from timber products or from could be carbon credits as well, or other sources, and gradually you start to see cash flows close enough on the horizon for private sector investors to come in. Now, I could go into a lot more detail, but I'm also looking at the clock, so I'll probably keep you on track and stop here for now.
Great, thank you. Eloise, I'm going to come back to you for a final question on kind of reflection on your success to date. And, you know, what do you think is it about Kamaza that has proven attractive to investors? And do you have any plans on expanding beyond Kenya?
Question for me? Does it work? Yeah. Well, what we call the triple bottom line is always a very big, a very important point for investors, the fact that you can have a positive impact on the communities, on the climate, and also be a commercial success. So that's been the case of Kamaza from the start, but I think the real selling point has been the scalability of the project. It's one of the first projects in this region that wanted to restore land at scale and even beyond the boundaries of Kenya. And that's also how we sort of applied the venture mindset to a topic that was very, very much NGO, reserved to NGOs and very localized projects. So now that Kamaza has proven that you can replicate the model from the coast of Kenya, which is a very particular ecosystem, to central Kenya, where we've expanded in the past 2 years and completely different agroecological zone, etc. We can replicate in other countries and regions as well. So that's definitely on the agenda. And we could expand geographically, and there also, I think, the possibility to expand in the range of activities we do. So forestry has been the focus because it's before carbon markets allowed it. It was probably the only like the most profitable business model we could find on degraded landscapes. But now with carbon, with restoration being financed and being revenue generating, it changes the story. And so Kamaza could leverage the exact same smallholder system and model to do assisted regeneration, to do soil carbon, to do agriculture, etc. So the extent of possibilities is huge. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Eloise. Coming to you, Alan. What do you think is the role of different types of capital within the EFIB fund? And how does grant funding and TA, through programs like P4F, enhance the environmental and social impact of the fund in the long run?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because I think one of my favorite things about this investment, many favorite things, but one of them is the design. And I think the way that we've used different types of capital to enhance that impact is going to ensure that it's really effective in the long term. So very briefly, I mentioned we'd reach first close of 200 million. We are actively looking to close new rounds and take us up to that 500 million mark, and that certainly needs to include private sector capital. I think we're all probably in agreement on the panel today that we cannot tackle climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, and ensure sustainable development with just public funding alone. And so the goal of AFIP is really to mobilize private sector investment into African forestry. And we are considering whether some of the principles that Yoram outlined, like blending, would be helpful to do this. So that's sort of on the main fund. Then I mentioned the landscape-based approach, and this is hugely exciting. How can we increase sustainable development around the assets, really enhance restoration and sustainable livelihoods? And we've got different pools of capital to help us do this. So at COP26, we announced the Climate Innovation Facility. This is a pool of capital from FCDO, our shareholder, and it's very concessional and allows us to back really exciting emerging business models, kind of like the ones you mentioned with TreeVive, that really need concessional capital to scale. And finally, we partnered with P4F on the TA part of this facility, which is hugely important. We're using some money at the moment to help us design the facility and really ensure that we maximize the impact. So that grant funding has been essential and is already so helpful. Also, TA will come in when we're thinking about project preparation. So if we see sustainable livelihoods or restoration investments that aren't quite yet investment ready, we're really excited about the potential to use P4F and TA there. So it's been a great partnership so far, and hopefully that's a little insight into the capital structure of the fund.
Great, thanks, Ellen. And then Derek, I'm conscious we're out of time, but if you could quickly summarize based on what you've heard today, what more can be done to encourage smallholders to adopt these restorative practices, whether it's private sector investment or whatever your key takeaways are?
I think in short for me, I would say let's move away from the norm. Because I think previously we have been talking about afforestation, more or less like a public relations stunt, a PR stunt. But we have seen companies saying that we have planted 50,000, 100,000 trees. But the question is, those trees have been planted for what purpose, where, and what are the monitoring mechanisms and management mechanisms? So I think let's move away from the public relations stunt and engage farmers as a key stakeholder. I know there are other stakeholders, but in the context of Southern Africa, farmers are the ones that have the land. So we might identify a certain communal land and plant 50,000 trees there, but who is going to take care of those? So it has now started emerging that farmers are realizing the need of reforestation, and if we engage them, we should be able now to sustainably restore our land. That's the first thing. The second thing I think is to come up with the models that are really going to monetize afforestation work. Yeah. With that, farmers now will start seeing the need, because as of now, farmers are engaging to unsustainable coping mechanisms that are even doing more harm to the environment. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much. I think if I can summarize the really key themes that I've seen come out from this discussion is the importance of smallholders, landscape approach, blended finance, and patient capital to really grow, scale, and replicate these models. Thank you all so much, and thank you for attending this session.